So, Chapter 2 really segues us from uh, European exploration and colonization in general to explaining how Britain, who originally wasn't even in the picture, became such a significant power in North America. So, here we go. So, first, things that are kind of a review of what we talked last chapter. European countries that came to the New World had different motivations. They started out, especially with the Spanish, with these first two, precious metals and sugar plantations, and then raw materials beyond these precious metals were sought by some of the other European powers like the French and the Dutch, such as the fur trade. Now, Spain colonizes most of Central and South America, but they also expand into what is today the Gulf Coast, the Mississippi River Delta, and the American West, today the Rocky Mountain region. And why? Well, for the most part, they wanted to continue their sugar growing, which the southernmost parts of what is today the United States, that's where sugar can be grown. And they also wanted to continue trying to mine for precious metals, which is where the Rocky Mountain region comes into play. So in the Gulf Coast and Mississippi River Delta, this is where sugar is going to be most predominant reason for coming this far north. And then the Rocky Mountain region is going to be due to the continued search for precious metals, possibly jewels. And then you'll see they also go into what is today Southern California, and reason being, being along the coast, they can have a lot of ports and trading outposts along that section. So this is the Spanish Empire around 1600. And you can see what we discussed a lot more in the previous chapter of the Caribbean that had been discovered, or I shouldn't say discovered, it always existed, that had been stumbled upon by Columbus, and then New Spain, both in the former Aztec and Mayan empires, as well as the Incan Empire in the Andes mountain range in South America. So this we discussed a whole lot more in the last chapter, and this map is a good visual of the Spanish Empire. So, motivations. What kept others coming beyond the Spanish, especially because Spain is the premier power in Europe? Why would anyone want to stick their nose into the Western Hemisphere and risk possibly having to fight the Spanish? Well, France and the Netherlands are most interested in setting up trade relations, trade settlements, and that's why I use the term settled for France coming into the Mississippi River Valley, the Great Lakes region, eastern Canada, the Hudson Bay, and they really just wanted to focus on trade. The same reason when the Netherlands moves into the modern Hudson and Delaware River valleys in New York and New Jersey, it is really their interest in the fur trade. And I mentioned before the Dutch use of the beaver on the seal of their New Netherlands colonies. And then also here you have a map of the holdings of the French and the Dutch. And I say holdings, that there were not a lot of permanent settlement in these regions. It is really just trading outposts from their perspective. Now, In the 1500s, why is Britain becoming a part of the conversation? Is really the goal of this chapter. Where do the British fit in here? How do they fit in here? And the answer to that really is that Britain kind of lucked out for the most part because they're a second-rate power in Europe. And the lands that they were claiming in the New World weren't seen as useful by other powers. There's a reason the Spanish didn't continue further into North America. They didn't believe it was worth fighting over with the French, Dutch, or British. The two things that really drastically changed the British Empire's world standing, the thing that really allowed them to luck out, is the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, as well as the growth of their British American colonies. They end up essentially muscling the Dutch right out of North America without much of a fight, and then they end up fighting the 7 Years' War with the French, part of which, because it was a global war, but part of which was fought in North America and is commonly referred to in American history as the French and Indian War. So anyway, these two things really lead to a growth in prestige for the British Empire. So the British North American colonies, why did nobody else really see them as valuable? Well, there's really no large precious metal stores. There's not jewels to be found. The climate's not very conducive to growing sugarcane or another cash crop. But the things that allowed for the colonies to flourish. First, the fur trade. It was just as profitable to the British as it was the French and Dutch, and there's a reason that the British want to muscle the Dutch out and then are willing to fight the French. And the fertile soil did allow for foodstuffs and some cash crops to flourish, but really it was the foodstuffs, the furs, the other raw materials that could be put back into the remainder of the British Empire via mercantilism, and we'll get into that a lot more moving forward. The British are benefiting from what the land has to offer them. So, foodstuffs are grown in what comes to be known as the Middle Colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, parts of Maryland. Cash crops are grown in what is modern Virginia, the Carolinas, other southern colonies, and it's the trading of these raw materials that is the most profitable within the British Empire. And a lot of that is done in natural deep sea ports like Boston in Massachusetts, also other places, Connecticut, Rhode Island, etc. And this is the New England colonies. So you have these three regions of the colonies well depicted in this map here. And these colonies, as shown in 1775 on the verge of the Revolution, are a big, big moneymaker for the British Empire. Now, who is coming to the New World? Who's leaving Britain and coming to the New World? Lower class folks are desperate for a better chance in life, and their best chance for that is in the New World. So landless peasants is the largest portion of the population that is leaving Britain and coming to the New World. Throughout the 14 and 1500s, landlords closed off what had once been considered common land usable by all, and they raised rents to out-of-control prices, and so people needed a better option. There's two ways of getting to the New World and seeking that better chance. You could become an indentured servant, which meant you would sign a contract promising your labor, more or less making you a slave, for an average of 4 to 9 years. The most common contract was signed for 7 years, and by promising 7 years of your labor, you were given free passage to the colonies. The other option, and believe it or not, in today's world, we think of military service as honorable, reputable, a good opportunity, ROTC and things like that. In the modern world, in the United States military, can offer you free college tuition, for example, paid for by the military. In this time period, to become a British soldier, unless you were a rich or prestigious person that wanted to become a high-ranking officer, this is like your occupation of last resort. But if you're super desperate and you don't want to be an indentured servant, you might become a soldier or a sailor in the British military. So these are the two big ways that you get yourself to the New World. Now, why are they willing to give 7 years of their labor? Why are they willing to take this not attractive role of being in the British military? Well, they are desperate to get some property of their own. And again, here is this saying, land is liberty. It's a little saying that we can use to focus our attention around why are people making this sacrifice, because they think they could get some access to land. So land or some other form of property is really their basis of liberty and freedom, and being self-sufficient really is the most important thing, particularly to a lower class person that's never had that self-sufficiency before. So being a laborer for 7 years or a British soldier for a certain amount of time was worth it to eventually own your own land or other form of property. Now, how do you acquire the land? Britain, if you remembered our conversation of if you were to have a spectrum, and at one end of the spectrum you had Spain, which was like the Death Star in Star Wars. You roll in and rape, pillage, and burn, kill everyone in your path if necessary. At the other end of the spectrum, you would have the French or the Dutch that are really just looking to have trade relations. The British fall somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, and they are not interested in being quite as aggressive as the Spanish, but they're far more interested in permanent settlement than the French and the Dutch are. So they really have no desire to subjugate the native population for a slave labor force, but they do need permanent settlement in order to profit from the foodstuff and cash crop farming that is going to become a major part of their economy. So this is often done through a series of unfair treaties negotiated after military defeats of native tribes, or sometimes without even a military defeat, just manipulative negotiations. Because there are different languages being spoken, you would use a interpreter who was more loyal to you, obviously, and would manipulate native tribes into signing treaties that were really giving away land to Europeans. Never would have been agreed to other than these manipulative negotiations. So sometimes it is military conquest, other times it is these manipulative treaties. Clashes between frontier settlers and native tribes existed nearly immediately after the founding of Jamestown and Plymouth, and lasted right through the Revolutionary War period. And it is one of the causes of the American Revolution, actually, when Europeans that maybe are just getting out of their indenture contracts are being told they cannot settle what was then known as the West, what is today known as the Midwest or the Ohio River Valley. And the big concern for the British Empire is avoiding further conflict with the native population, but these Europeans that are desperate for access to land, this really makes them quite angry. You can see via this map, the Proclamation line runs all the way down the Appalachian Mountains, and that was the barrier. The Appalachian Mountains was the 1763 barrier. This is actually a question that pops up on the Regents exam quite often. What is the western boundary in 1763? It's the Appalachians. And then after the American Revolution, you see this pink salmon coloration that brings what becomes the United States after the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The western border becomes the Mississippi River. So that's another one. What is the western border in 1783 after the end of the Revolution? And the answer to that one is the Mississippi River. But again, that's really just like a tidbit of information for what the Regents exam likes to ask. But anyway, it's the Appalachian Mountains in 1763 that a lot of these lower class folks are like, geez, that was our best chance at land, and now you're telling us no? It is one of the main reasons that the population of the British colonies starts to turn against the British Empire. So you have some pretty drastic changes going on for Native Americans. First of all, you have the Columbian Exchange, which we already mentioned Charles Mann and his writings, and how smallpox and other diseases devastated somewhere between 95 and 98% of the Native American population. But more commonly, the Columbian Exchange is spoken of not so much with the disease, which was probably the single biggest impact, but the exchange in goods across the Atlantic. Things that did not exist to Native Americans were brought by Europeans, such as horses. Things that were not known to Europe were brought back to Europe after interacting in the New World, and one of those would be potatoes, which there's an entire book, How the Choctaw Saved the Irish, and it is about how by bringing potatoes back to Europe in the Columbian Exchange, the Irish were able to have a reliable, cheap, and easy to grow food source. You also have changes to the land. We already mentioned this once in the previous chapter, this concept of sensory warfare, which a war on the native senses. And I mentioned the book that I read in college, Sensory Worlds in Early America. The book was awful. It was not very well written. It was not very entertaining, but the concepts in it and the discussions I had in the class after reading it were actually quite fascinating. If you think about this concept of sensory warfare and a war on the senses, think about smell. Europeans were not very cleanly people. They smelled. If you think about your sight, when Europeans started popping up forts and fences, and well, why would you waste your time doing that? What are they doing making these forts and fences? They did not even look necessary. Again, loud gunpowder, the firing of muskets is an attack on your hearing senses. So there are various ways to look at your senses and how this would be a drastic change and a scary change to the native population. The cutting of forests to build homes, to build forts and fences, to heat those homes once you've built them. Again, it was deforestation that was, from the view of the native population, devastating to the ecosystem, and why would you do such a thing? And then, of course, the depletion of animal populations via the fur trade. Natives absolutely also used furs, but they did so responsibly and would never have allowed for the complete decimation of any animal populations. So Europeans coming, and particularly the growth of the British American colonies, is quite devastating to the lifestyle of Native Americans right from day one. So a couple of the biggest, most well-known settlements of Europeans that grow into what becomes the United States after the Revolution. The Chesapeake region in Virginia, the Chesapeake Bay. Jamestown is settled by these lower class men who are employees of this company, the Virginia Company, and they're looking to get rich quick. They want to get in, find gold and silver, and leave and profit. Prepared really only for mining. They were unsuccessful at growing food, which they did not anticipate. They also had settled next to a malarial swamp, so they're all getting sick. And so there's this window of time called the starving time, in which they are not able to feed themselves. A lot of them are getting malaria. It's devastating. And in the first decade of settlement at Jamestown, it was actually abandoned twice and suffered an 80% death rate. So you hear about Jamestown and John Smith, and it sounds so like heroic. Like, yeah, look, they're starting this settlement from the ground up, and they're so proud of themselves. And well, actually, without the help of the local Powhatan tribe, named after their chief Powhatan, the settlement probably would have permanently failed. Which brings me, Chief Powhatan and the Powhatan tribe, to discuss the story of Pocahontas. What most Americans know is the Disney film, and while that might be entertaining to children, it is very drastically historically inaccurate. For example, the scene in which she rescues John Smith because she is supposedly in love with him, not at all the case. This was actually likely a ceremony that John Smith was ceremonially about to be killed, but then somebody rescues them. And not only is it to show Chief Powhatan's power over European settlers in the region, like, hey, I'm still in charge here, but it was also to show that John Smith was now going to be, having been symbolically saved, become like an accepted member of their society. The reality also is that she never really loved John Smith. She married a man named John Rolfe, as a matter of fact, who came later, and Rolfe had a much greater impact in the history of Virginia and its growth and development than probably anyone else in early history since the founding of Jamestown. And why? Because he smuggles tobacco seeds into Virginia, which is what finally turns things around. It goes from a miserable failure of a society to a society centered around the growth of tobacco as a cash crop. Then you have the Puritans in New England, what comes to be known as New England. The Puritans supposedly were leaving Europe because of religious persecution, but it was really actually, if you study it deeply enough, they're high and mighty, more holy than thou. They essentially ran around telling everybody, you're all going to hell because you're sinners, and we are the only truly holy people. People got sick and tired of hearing that, and so they more or less are like, Puritans, get out of here. And the Puritans do. They leave. They go to what is today New England. They meant to go to Virginia, but they got off course and they land in what is today Massachusetts, specifically Plymouth. And they also go through a starving time of their own because they were trying to plant in what was not extremely fertile soil, not naturally fertile anyway, until Tisquantum, better known as Squanto, and the Pokanoket tribe helps them out. One way was showing them how to use fish carcasses after hunting and fishing, to use the fish carcasses and other things that would turn into, that would rot and then turn into fertilizer to plant their crops. He also showed them the strategy of how to plant the three sisters, as it is called: corn, beans, and squash. Three crops that grow really well when planted together. So again, this is much like the story of Pocahontas and the Powhatan, that without the help of Squanto and the Pokanoket tribe, the settlers at Plymouth probably also would have had to permanently abandon and leave their settlement. But things kind of grow from here, and it's really the British realizing how profitable the raw materials they can pull off these lands are that leads to the British saying, hey, we should muscle out the Dutch. Eventually, we'll talk about them being willing to fight the French, and it really just kind of explains how the British enter the picture in history of North America, in the history of North America. So that is chapter 2. Feel free to reach out with any questions.